Alright, it is part 2 of reading to Chompers. I am still reading The Hobbit. I have not made it through the first chapter, so. What on earth did I ask him to tea for? He said to himself as he went to the pantry. He had only just had breakfast, but he thought a cake or two and a drink of something would do him good after his fright. Gandalf, in the meantime, was quietly standing outside the door and laughing long but quietly. After a while he stepped up, and with the spike on his staff, scratched a queer sign on the Hobbit's beautiful green front door. Then he strode away, just about time when Bilbo was finishing his second cake and beginning to think that he had escaped adventures very well. The next day he had almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well unless he put them down in his engagement tablet like this: Gandalf, tea, Wednesday. Yesterday he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Just before tea time there came a tremendous ring on the front doorbell, and then he remembered. He rushed and put on the kettle and put out another cup and saucer, and an extra cake or two, and ran to the door. "I am so sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf, with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt, and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside, just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg. "Dwalin, at your service," he said with a long bow. "Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added, "I am just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little stiff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. "And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation?" They had not been at the table long, in fact they had hardly reached the third cake, when there came another even louder ring at the bell. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and off he went to the door. "So you have got here at last." That was what he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it was not Gandalf. Instead there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step, with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was open, just as if he had been invited. "I see they have begun to arrive already," he said when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it, and "Balin, at your service," he said with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then, as the host, he knew his duty, and stuck to it however painful, he might have to go without. "Come along in and have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better, if it is all the same to you, my good sir." Said Balin with the white beard. "Sorry, I'm a little sleepy today. But I don't mind some cake, seed cake if you have any." "Lots," Bilbo found himself answering, to his own surprise. He found himself scuttling off, too, to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and then to a pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes, which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and cake in front of them when loud came a ring at the bell again, and then another ring. Gandalf for certain this time, he thought as he puffed along the passage, but it was not. It was 2 more dwarves, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped as soon as the door began to open. Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarves?" he said. "Kili, at your service, and Fili," added the other. They both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin here already, I see," said Kili. "Let us join the throng." "Throng!" thought Mr. Baggins. I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He'd only just had a sip in the corner while the four dwarfs sat round the table and talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and the depredation of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded too much adventurous, when a ding-dong-a-ling-ding. His bell rang again as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some four, I should say, by the sound," he said feebly. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands and wondered what had happened, and what was going to happen, whether they would all stay for supper. Then the bell rang again, even louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not 4 after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wondering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dori, Nori, Orin, Oin, and Gloin were the names. Very soon 2 purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had become a throng, and some called for ale, some for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, so the Hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set on the hearth, the seed cakes were gone, and the dwarfs were starting a round of buttered scones, when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the Hobbit's beautiful green door. Someone was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry and altogether bewildered and bewildered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of the other. More dwarfs, 4 more, and there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent in the beautiful door, and had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that had been put there the morning before. Carefully. It is not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat, and then open the door like a popgun. Let me introduce Bifur, Bofur, Bombur, and especially Thorin. "At your service," said Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur, standing in a row. Then they all hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last one belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf, in fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur on top of him. For one thing, Bombur was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin, indeed, was very haughty, and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that the last thing he grunted, "Pray don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now we are all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there is something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine for me, I think." "And for me," said Thorin. And raspberry jam and apple tart," said Bifur. "And mince pies and cheese," said Bofur. "And pork pie and salad," said Bombur. "And more cakes, and ale, and coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarves through the door. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him as the hobbits stumped off to the pantries. "And just bring out the cold chicken and pickles." "Seems to know as much about the inside of my larders as I do myself," thought Mr. Baggins, who was positively flummoxed, and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on the big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face and annoyed. "Confusticate and be bothered, these dwarves," he said aloud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand? Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, and Fili and Killy behind them. And before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and a couple small tables into the parlour and set out everything fresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarves all round, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside, nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary, and not in the least an adventure. The dwarves ate, and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. "I suppose you will all stay for supper," he said in his politest, unpressing tones. "Of course," said Thorin, "and after, we shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now, to clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarves, not Thorin, he was too important, and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped to their feet, and made tall piles of things, and off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on the top, and with one hand, while the Hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright, "Please be careful, and please don't trouble, I can manage." But the dwarves only started to sing, "Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggin hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread on the fat, pour the milk on the pantry floor, leave the bones on the bedroom mat, splash the wine on every door, dump the crocks in a boiling bowl, pound them up with a thumping pole, and when you've finished, if there are any whole, send them down the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates, so carefully with the plates." And of course they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was cleaned and put away safe as quick as lightning, while the Hobbit was turning round and round in the middle of the kitchen, trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin with his feet on the fender, smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and wherever he told one to go, it went. Up the chimney, or behind the clock in the mantelpiece, or under the table, or round and round the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He sent another smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe straight through each one of Thorin's. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head. He had a cloud of them about him already, and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched. He loved smoke rings, and then he blushed to think about how proud he had been yesterday morning of the smoke rings he had sent up the wind over the hill. "Now for some music," said Thorin. "Bring out some instruments." Killy and Fili rushed for their bags and brought back little fiddles. Dori, Nori, and Ori brought out flutes from somewhere inside their coats. Somewhere. Bomber produced a drum from the hall. Where exactly? Lifer and Bofur went out too, came back with clarinets they had left among the walking sticks. Dwalin and Balin said, "Excuse me, I left mine in the porch. Just bring mine with you," said Thorin. They came back with viols as big as themselves, and with Thorin's harp wrapped in a green cloth. It was a beautiful golden harp, and when Thorin struck it, the music began all at once, so sudden and sweet that Bilbo forgot everything else. He was swept away into the dark lands under strange moons, far over the water, and very far away from his hobbit hole under the hill. The dark came into the room from the little window that opened on the side of the hill. Firelight flickered. It was April, and still they played on, while the shadow of Gandalf's beard wagged against the wall. The dark filled all the room. The fire died down, and the shadows were lost, and still they played on. And suddenly, first one, then another, began to sing as they played, deep-throated singing of the dwarves in the deep places of their ancient homes. And this is like a fragment of their song, if it can be their song without their music. Far over the misty mountains go, to dungeons deep, Take the pale enchanted gold, dwarves of yore, made mighty spell, all hairs fell like ringing bells, places deep where dark things sleep, in hollow halls beneath the fells, for ancient king and elvish lord, and then I'm not gonna sing the rest of this. There many a gleaming golden hoard they shaped and wrought, and light they caught to hide in gems on hilt of sword. On silver necklaces they strung the flowering stars, on crowns they hung the dragon fire and twisted wire. They meshed the light of moon and sun. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to claim our long forgotten gold. Goblets they carved there for themselves, and harps of gold where no man dwells. There they lay long, and many a song was sung unheard by men or elves. The pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night, the fire was red, it flaming spread, the trees like torches blazed with light. The bells were ringing in the dale, and the men looked up with faces pale. The dragon's ire is more fierce than fire, laid low their towers and houses frail. The mountains smoked beneath the moon, the dwarves they heard the tramp of doom. They fled their hall into dying fall, beneath his feet, beneath the moon. Far over the misty mountains grim, to dungeons deep and caverns dim, we must away ere breaks of day, and win our harps of gold from him. As they sang, the hobbit fell to the love of beautiful things made by hands and by cunning and by magic moving through him. A fierce and jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. Then something tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains, and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls, and explore the caves, and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked out of the window. The stars were out in the dark sky above the trees. He thought of the jewels, the dwarves shining in dark caves. Suddenly, in the wood beyond the water, a flame leapt up, probably someone lighting a wood fire, and he thought of plundering dragons, settling on his quiet hill and kindling it all to flames. He shuddered, and very quickly he was plain Mr. Baggins of Baggin Underhill again. He got up, trembling, had less than half a mind to fetch the lamp, and more than half a mind to pretend to, and go and hide behind the beer barrels of the cellar and not come out again until all the dwarves had gone away. Suddenly he found that the music and the singing had stopped. They were all looking at him, their eyes shining in the dark. "Where are you going?" said Thorn, in a tone that seemed to show what he guessed both halves of the hobbit's mind. "What about a little light?" said Bilbo apologetically. "We like the dark," said all the dwarves. "Dark but dark business. There are many hours before dawn." "Of course," said Bilbo, and sat down in a hurry. He missed the stool and sat on the fender, knocking the poker and shovel with a crash. "Hush," said Gandalf. "Let Thorin speak." And this is how Thorin began. "Gandalf, dwarves, and Mr. Baggins, we are met together in the house of our friend and fellow conspirator, this most excellent and audacious hobbit. May the hair on his toes never fall out. All praise to his wine and ale." He paused for breath, and for a polite remark from the hobbit, but the compliments were quite lost on poor Bilbo, who was wagging his mouth in protest at being called audacious, and worst of all, fellow conspirator. Though no noise came out, he was so flummoxed. So Thorin went on. "We are met to discuss our plans, our ways, means, policy, and devices. We shall soon, before the break of day, start on a long journey. A journey from which some of us, or perhaps all of us, except our friend and counselor, the ingenious wizard Gandalf, may never return. It is a solemn moment. Our object is, I take it, well known to us all. To estimable Mr. Baggins, and perhaps to one or two of the younger dwarves, I think I should be right in naming Keely and Feely, for instance. The exact situation at the moment at hand may require a little brief explanation. This was Thorin's style. He was an important dwarf. If he had been allowed, he would probably have gone on like this until he was out of breath, without telling anyone there anything that was not known already. But he was rudely interrupted. Poor Bilbo couldn't bear it any longer. At may never return, he began to feel a shriek coming up inside him, and very soon it burst out like the whistle of an engine coming out of a tunnel. All the dwarves sprang up, knocking over the table. Gandalf struck a blue light on the end of his magic staff, and its firework glare. The poor little hobbit could be seen. In its firework glare, the poor little hobbit could be seen kneeling on the hearth rug, shaking like jelly that was melting. Then he fell flat on the floor and kept calling out, struck by lightning, over and over again. And that was all they could get out of him for a long time. So they took him and laid him out of the way in the drawing-room sofa with a drink at his elbow, and they went back to their dark business. Excitable little fellow, said Gandalf, as they sat down again. Gets funny queer fits, but he is one of the best. As fierce as a dragon in a pinch. If you have ever seen a dragon in a pinch, you will realize that this was only poetical exaggeration applied to any hobbit, even to old Took's great-granduncle, Bullroarer, who was so huge for a hobbit that he could ride a horse. He charged the ranks of the goblins of Mount Graham in the Battle of the Green Fields, and knocked their king, Golfimble's head clean off with a wooden club. It sailed 100 yards through the air and went down a rabbit hole, and it is said. And in this way the battle was won, and the game of golf invented in the same moment. Okay, I'm having a little trouble reading, so I'm gonna have to cut this one off about here. See you in the next video.